Hello guys, Oscar Hotel 8, Sierra Tango November here from Survival Tech Nord. Today we're going to talk about winter deployments off-grid. For the ham radio operators amongst you, that means we're having a discussion, in part, about Winter Field Day. Now for those of you that don't know, Winter Field Day is kind of a preparedness event for the ham radio community. Winter Field Day is a training scenario allowing us to get prepared for off-grid or grid-down communications in a snowstorm, in winter conditions, in a blizzard, in all types of inclement weather. Now, even though the spirit of Winter Field Day has its roots firmly in preparedness, we rarely hear anyone talking about anything other than radio communications. Today we're going to take it a bit further by keeping it real. So if you stick with me, I'll tell you all about it.
You are listening to the Emergency Broadcast Systems. This station broadcasts emergency news and official information on the air for assigned area.
Firstly, I think it's critically important to understand what we mean by deployment and operating off-grid. In this context, we're talking about a lack of a physical connection to the network, or actually no network at all. It doesn't matter where you physically are. This could be in the middle of nowhere, or perhaps an exposed beach on the coast of Finland, but it could also be someplace much closer to home. What does matter is you understand everything required to keep your station up and running for the extent of your off-grid deployment. Up here at 65 degrees north, that means heat, shelter, and the ability to power your station for the duration of the mission. Which isn't a bad thing, as each region we deploy to ultimately has its own unique challenges to overcome. Now, before I start setting up my camp or chopping wood or even putting the wood stove together, we need to understand the mission. As a training scenario, the Winter Field Day Association gives us some guidelines to work by. So I know that it's a 24-hour event starting from 1900 UTC on the 25th of January and ending at 1900 UTC on the 26th of January. Simply knowing the duration of this off-grid event already gives me an awful lot of information I need to prepare for this mission. It tells me that I need to provide heat for 24 hours, I need 24 hours of station power, I need food and water for 24 hours, and I need the ability to cook that food or boil that water for up to 24 hours. In addition to that, I'll need some reserves just in case I'm left out there a little longer than I planned for. The Winter Field Day Association also tells us what bands and modes we can use, and that was all non-work amateur bands and all modes capable of managing the exchange. It was also important to keep in mind the start and stop times of the event. Most experienced radio operators understand operating at a specific time of day versus the band they're operating on offers certain advantages or disadvantages for the part of the world we're trying to reach. That's true for both local and DX communications. In other words, unlike other aspects of amateur radio, we're not shooting for the random QSO. In fact, in regards to IMCOM, we're almost always searching for a specific station, gateway, or net. You see, if we don't understand the relationship between the time of day, the bands we choose to use, and the maximum usable frequency, it won't be possible to come up with a good antenna configuration for the regions or stations we're trying to target. Really though, it's not just about the antenna. Everything we've been talking about for the last couple of minutes are considerations we need to keep in mind when we're planning our mission, our target stations, and how we're going to equip and configure our stations for the duration of this event. Let's take a look at the choices I made for my station and why. So really, the first challenge was protecting myself and my station for 24 hours during winter. To achieve that, I decided on the Nortent Gamme 4, or what we call in the channel, the bunker. I chose it because it completely encapsulates myself and the station. It's impervious to crazy amounts of wind, It's easy to set up with mittens, and of course it's got a built-in stove jack. Now, to provide heat for the shelter, prevent condensation on my radio equipment, and keep myself comfortable for that 24-hour stretch, I decided to use my titanium wood stove. Ultimately, I decided on 2 different types of wood. I started off with birch because it's extremely easy to start and it burns really hot. Then I kept topping off the stove with spruce because it's more slow burning. Now, once it was warm inside, it was pretty easy to keep it warm, simply adding a couple of more logs to the fire. To keep the station powered up for that 24-hour requirement, I used the PowerFilm FM16 7200. That's a 120 watt flexible solar panel. I coupled that with my 45 amp hour DIY solar generator we built on the channel last year. This generator will happily run the FT891 and the Raspberry Pi for days at a time without even connecting the solar panel. Now, although we could technically power the station for this 24-hour mission using a battery storage on its own, we use a solar panel to continuously top up the solar generator in the event we need to power up more gear or if we're going to deploy someplace else. In any event, it's never a bad thing to keep our portable power topped up. Now, this brings us to the radio equipment I decided to use for Winter Field Day. Now, there's a reason I'm showing you the stove and the wood and the radio equipment's carrying case before I show you the station set up. Unless you happen to be using a green radio, it's critically important to establish a stable temperature inside your shelter before you deploy your radio equipment. One of the easiest ways we can destroy our ham radio rigs in the field is by not managing the condensation and the moisture inside our shelters. So, once I had a stable temperature inside the shelter, I was able to start setting up my communications gear. Now, naturally, I'm using my Yaesu FT891 and the Raspberry Pi, but I've upgraded the Raspberry Pi since the last time you saw it. We'll get back to the Raspberry Pi in a second, but for now, take a look at the Raspberry Pi and the Yaesu FT891. The Raspberry Pi is attached to the top of the Yaesu FT891, and all cables between the radio and the Raspberry Pi are already connected. So in practice, the only thing we have to do is connect our antenna and our Raspberry Pi and radio power supply. Now, this is really important because it alleviates all the fumbling and messing around with the wires. Now, if you watch closely, I've plugged in the Raspberry Pi to the solar generator, and now I'm going to click that on button. Now, this time I used the real-time clock on the PiJuice Hat, but we're still using the GPS to back up the real-time clock's time. Since we're now using Buster on the Raspberry Pi 4, I think I need to do a new tutorial on the real-time clock. Anyway, the GPS and real-time clock have been rock solid and time is not an issue. Now I'll go ahead and plug in the power cable for the Yaesu FT891 into the solar generator. You might notice I don't have any fuses between the Raspberry Pi and the solar generator and the radio and the solar generator, and that's because all the ports on my solar generator are already fused. At this point, almost everything is ready to go. I'll plug in the antenna cable and I'll be ready to start up the Yaesu FT891. As you can see, the whole system starts up like a champ. So now we can take the tablet and actually see what's going on with the Raspberry Pi. It actually starts itself up headless, so it requires no user interaction from me. So when the Raspberry Pi boots up, it'll start up an app called RaspPap, or Raspbian Access Point. After that, it'll check if there's a home network available and connect to it. Simultaneously, it creates its own Wi-Fi network so that the portable computer can always connect to that. Finally, it'll start up the GPS and update the time if required. So now I'm connected to the Wi-Fi network created by my Raspberry Pi, and I can use my tablet to go ahead and log on to the Raspberry Pi with my VNC client. You see guys, it really pays to put the work in and understand how these things work, regardless if you're using a Raspberry Pi or a Windows machine or a Mac or whatever. My belief is a good radio operator is going to invest the time on the test bench to understand how all this works, configure it, so that we can have an easier to use, more intuitive system in the field. If you'd like more information about how we got here with the Raspberry Pi, please check the description for the Raspberry Pi Field Computer YouTube playlist. You'll find an incredible amount of useful information there. Now I think it's a good time to start talking about the antennas used for Winter Field Day. Now if you remember earlier in the video, we talked about the mission, target stations, target regions, and the relationship between the time of day and our antenna configurations. Realistically, my options were local communications with NVIS, that's Near Vertical Incidence Skywave, or regional communications plus, which is inside Scandinavia and mainland Europe, and finally DX communications with Gray Line, which would be North America or South America. To meet all of these different requirements, I had 3 different antennas. For NVIS or local communications, I decided on a horizontal wire. That was the Chameleon MCOM3 portable. Ultimately, I didn't make any NVIS QSOs, but it's better to have it and not need it than to need it and not have it. I'll leave information about this antenna and the other 2 we'll talk about in the description. Now, my primary antenna for the event was the Super Antenna MP1. I had it set up on 40 meters with 3 counterpoise wires, 2 extension rods underneath the coil, and 2 extension rods plus the titanium whip above the coil. Both transmission and reception were excellent with this antenna. In fact, it did much of the heavy lifting during Winter Field Day. So not only did it do an excellent job inside of Scandinavia and Europe, it also got my signal into North America. Now unfortunately, my signal arrived pretty weak on the other side of the Atlantic. So despite consistently hitting North America, I didn't actually make any QSOs there. I've got a theory about this I'll share with you in a second. Now my third and final antenna was the Chameleon MPAS 2.0. I took this antenna along because I wanted to have one broadband antenna capable of multi-band hopping without me having to go out and readjust it for a new frequency or band. One of the harsh realities about operating in Arctic conditions is frostbite. Every time you have to go outside the shelter, readjust an antenna or wind up a wire or do anything with your hands that you can't do while wearing mittens, you have the risk of frostbite. So in this regard, a broadband antenna with a tuner inbuilt in your radio or externally can be your best friend. Now one of the mistakes I think I made was positioning the Super Antenna MP1 and the Chameleon MPAS 2.0 much too close together. I realized far too late on the first day that there might have been some coupling going on between these antennas. On the second day, I simply deployed the MP1 as a monoband vertical on 40 meters. In reality, these are the type of mistakes we can only make if we actually get out in the field and do some testing. So even with an easy location like I operated from during this Winter Field Day, the experience we gain in the field is priceless. And one of the most important aspects of winter deployment is understanding radio communications isn't the only thing we're doing in the field station. Radio communications during winter or adverse weather is pretty extreme because ultimately we're operating a radio relatively motionless inside a shelter. The hard reality here is if we're not moving, we're not creating heat. Ultimately, this means an important aspect of keeping our stations operational is generating heat and comfort for the operator. This also means we have to keep ourselves hydrated and fed. The reason this is so important is there's not always going to be the logistics machine behind your deployment. Sometimes we're deploying for ourselves, for our families, for preparedness. And even in deployments for emergency communications, there isn't always that logistics machine available. So not only do radio operators need to understand how to communicate, they also need to understand how to sustain themselves in the field. Of course, how we do that is an individual choice, but we always have to have some kind of plan. For short deployments, I rely on all-natural dehydrated foods, and more specifically, dehydrated soups. These dehydrated soups are a pretty lightweight and cost-effective way of maintaining ourselves on deployments. Naturally, we can buy them commercially, or we can make them ourselves. Which one we choose is entirely up to the individual operator. Perhaps it's becoming more clear why I focus on the deployment of my amateur radio field station for Winter Field Day. Once again, with this type of Winter Field Day deployment, we have the opportunity to invest in ourselves and invest in our field radio deployment skill set. On its own, being able to exchange points in a contest isn't going to save you or help anyone in an emergency communications or communications for preparedness scenario. So, we really shouldn't be afraid of challenging ourselves in the field. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and put this soup down, let it cool off, throw a couple of logs on the fire, and then we can start talking about the QSOs. Now, I had a few successes and a couple of huge failures. Email was a complete failure this year. We can come back to that in a second, but for now, let's talk about my favorite mode, JS8 Call. Now, JS8 Call is my favorite mode because it has all the aspects of FT8 without any of the weaknesses. It also has all the aspects of an efficient network mode. Now, I also operated on the 25th of January, although the event hadn't started yet. I did this to test the field station and actually not for the points. This really gave me an indication of what to expect on Sunday when Winter Field Day really got kicked off in my time zone. So I was grateful to make contacts with portable stations, fixed stations, club stations, and other stations also working Winter Field Day. And all of these contacts were done with the various modes of JS8 Call. Now, those contacts weren't always easy, but they were almost always successful. Now, people keep asking me, why am I using JS8 Call or other data modes for communications primarily? The simple truth is, if I'm a station, for example, in Chicago or Kansas City, the operator density or the number of stations around that operator offers many more possibilities than a station at 65 degrees north. Not only is my station much further away, operating at higher latitudes is much more challenging than operating closer to the equator. So using a narrow bandwidth data mode actually balances things out. So the disadvantages of being a low power station in the middle of nowhere near the Arctic Circle are offset by using a very efficient narrow bandwidth data mode. It can also be decoded under the noise floor, unlike CW. It certainly would be awesome having some SSB QSOs, for example, but I'm just not one of those guys who wants to run an amplifier. Anyway, on Sunday I got the wind behind my back, and QSOs turned out to be much stronger, much better throughout Scandinavia, Europe, and the UK. In fact, I can absolutely tell you, I was having a blast. Another exciting aspect about getting on air and testing your station is the messages that you receive from people around the world. My goal in making these videos is to inspire 1 operator, 2 operators, 5 operators, 10 operators to step up their game and become better operators. It's a lot like planting seeds with the hope that those new operators inspired by these videos will also go on to plant their own seeds. But when you have the opportunity to read on your screen the impact you've made on a human being on the other side of the world or someplace else on the continent, it really makes a difference. It's fuel for the fire. This is when we begin to understand the impact we're making on other operators and why continuing and pushing forward is important. Come Sunday 1700 UTC on the 26th, I was pretty happy with the QSOs I gathered in my logbook. Many of the QSOs were specific winter field day exchanges, but most of them were actual real discussions on air. Now, I also had some North American stations coming in, and that was a brilliant surprise. I was really happy about that. By the time I got back to those stations, none of them came back to me. I guess I lost my gray line window for making contacts to North America. Now, despite this, it was amazing to know I was being spotted in North America. I was being spotted all throughout Europe and even in Japan. And just to be clear, these weren't whisper spots. These were spots with JS8 call. If you get a spot with JS8 call, it actually means you can have a QSO with that station. People often see me sharing these maps and incorrectly assume that they are generated via whisper. But these are JS8 call. Anyway, I tried, I failed, they didn't hear me or didn't come back to me. That's just how it is. It was actually nice getting a response through Facebook from that station in Puerto Rico, saying it was excellent to see my station on his screen. Now, there really is one more important thing we need to talk about with JS8 call. When there was a strong station I was trying to reach, but he was busy or in a QSO, I actually left a message for that station. For the station in Puerto Rico, he came back via Facebook, as I mentioned a little while ago. But for the station in Norway, he came back strong and we had a very lengthy QSO. You have to understand, JS8 call is decoding the entire bandpass. So you don't have to create QRM for a station who's having a QSO. You can move to another audio frequency and send a short directed message to that station while he or she is receiving. In most cases, that station will come back to you after reading that directed message because now they know that you are actually there and waiting. That was the case with the station in Norway, Kjetil, Lima Bravo 4, Foxtrot Hotel, Papa. He's one of my Instagram buddies and one of the stations I regularly see on the air in Scandinavia. And this was a huge lesson for me during Winterfield Day, using the tools that we have at our disposal to get that message through, to engage or interact with those stations that you see regularly on the air. If I wouldn't have left Kjetil a message, he may not have ever known I was trying to reach him. This is extremely valuable training for emergency communications and preparedness scenarios. Realistically, we really don't learn that much from a contest exchange. On the flip side, the benefits of getting hands-on experience operating in these types of events is absolutely immeasurable. Let's try to remember, the sole purpose of events like Winterfield Day and this channel is the inspiration for other operators to try to step up their radio communications game. It really doesn't matter if you're operating from a tent near the Arctic Circle or from your home. The only thing that truly matters is we get outside our comfort zones and we're actually improving our skills. Alright, because the focus of this video is actually winter deployment, there were a few enablers we need to talk about. Firstly, that's my hand axe from Fiskars. For sure, you've seen my other longer Fiskars axe in other videos, but this one I specifically use inside the shelter. Now, whenever it's possible, we want to do everything we possibly can inside the shelter. It may not be immediately obvious, but staying inside the shelter helps us prevent exposure from the elements. So the tools we use need to be compatible with life inside the shelter. Now, chopping wood may seem like a no-brainer, but before we can bring that wood inside the shelter, we need to chop it down to size so that it will fit into the titanium wood stove. For that, I use a Fiskars bow saw. Now, as with my axe, I do have additional saws, hand saws, and smaller bow saws. I like to carry this one though because it's narrow enough to fit in my pole sled and it's quite reliable. I think I've owned this one for 16 or 17 years, something like that, and I'm pretty satisfied with the Fiskars brand. Now, another enabler for the field station and winter deployment is the titanium wood stove. And whether I'm operating in the dead of winter, autumn, or spring, I almost always deploy with the wood stove. Honestly, it's a no-brainer. It weighs nothing, it sets up pretty easily, and it maintains a stable temperature inside our shelters. If I could wish for anything different, it would be a larger titanium wood stove. This way I could enjoy an entire night's sleep, if possible, without having to wake up and load wood back into the stove. Now, another winter deployment enabler we rarely think about is a sled, or in this case, a ski pulk sled. The ski pulk sled is like a Scandinavian multi-tool. It allows us to carry our entire field station, our camp, our provisions. It even allows us to harvest wood from the forest and bring it to our camp. Now, the last little thing is my Fiskars Shovel. It's a small camping shovel that goes everywhere my ski pulk goes and everywhere my tent or teepee goes. I simply forgot to take video material of the shovel, and I probably couldn't if I wanted to, since it was so cold. Anyway, I thought I would just give it a quick mention so you understood what equipment I carried with me. So, let's get to the final thoughts. I think going forward, I want to have an integrated radio, Raspberry Pi, and power source all inside of a Pelican case. Open the case, push the button, use the radio. Next is setting up a more reliable email. VHF email over packet is simply not reliable at 65 degrees north. Never mind the lack of RDOP compatible stations, and of course my own inexperience with PAT WinLink. So I'll definitely need to work on those. If this were a real life-saving emergency communications deployment, it would definitely need to be a multi-operator station. In my opinion, it simply isn't possible for a single operator managing the radio, managing the camp, doing the cooking, doing the chopping, cutting, and keeping the stove going for very long. Despite the challenges and necessary changes, the station will definitely keep moving forward on the channel. If you're supporting this channel through Patreon, PayPal, or simply sharing my content, you're absolutely magnificent and I couldn't do it without you. For the rest of you, if you like what I'm doing, if you like the content I'm creating, leave me a comment and a thumbs up to let me know. And if it's not too much to ask, please share this video with someone or someplace where other operators might enjoy it. Rock and roll, guys. Thanks for watching. Ciao.